Very good morning to all of you. I welcome you to this class on cultural policy. Let's first try to just have a working definition of cultural policy, and then we will, uh, of course, try to look at some of the other related aspects. Firstly, uh, why do we need something like cultural policy, or what does cultural policy do? Uh, when we talk about policy, of course, we understand that a, you know, it involves framing certain guidelines um, in order to achieve an objective. So, what is that objective of cultural policy? Basically, cultural policy aims to improve the cultural life of a community of people. I mean, that could be a country, that could be a more, limited, I mean, geographical area, or it could also intend to preserve the heterogeneity of culture. And third thing that cultural policy aims to achieve is to make culture more accessible to communities at large. And therefore, the whole idea of cultural policy is, quite closely connected to the proactive role of the government. And the government has to shape policies, cultural policies that enrich the cultural life of a community, helps to preserve the heterogeneity of cultures, and also make cultural forms more accessible for the masses. So, this is the target, this is the goal, and this is the objective with which cultural policy works. Now, having said that, before moving on to discuss cultural policy, let us first try to understand how this, um, what a right to culture is, because today we are talking about cultural policy as being such an integral component of cultural studies and as being such uh, an important area in itself, but it actually reflects uh, a gradual change in society itself. I mean, whatever happens in academics, of course, is a reflection of what is happening in society. So there was a point of time when the idea of right to culture gained in importance. It was not always there, historically speaking. We did not always have this tradition of talking about cultural rights. Now, that is where the United Nations had a crucial role to play. It was in 1948, after the formation of the United Nations, and particularly after the formation of the cultural wing. Of course, it became even more um, focused on the issue of cultural rights. But once the United Nations was floated and it was established, there was this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which asserted that everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community. I repeat, everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community. Now, this was not always there. Today, probably many of you might think when you hear this, what is so new about it? I mean, it's something that you take for granted, isn't it? Why shouldn't we have the right to culture? Everyone has the right to culture today. I mean, it has become such a common thing today that it's hard to imagine a time when it was not the case. The right to culture was not counted amongst uh, the most fundamental rights of an individual. I'm not saying fundamental right in the technical sense, but it is not considered to be inevitable, right? So there is, think about the long history of racism and think about the long history of imperialism, of colonialism, and you can understand what I mean. it was obviously not thought about very seriously. Cultural rights was considered to be a thing that is there, but not really very important. So um, this coming of the United Nations was a big step forward in this. Now, Rene uh, Mahieu, who was the Director General of the UNESCO or the cultural wing of the United Nations, he explained in 1970 that initially the idea of cultural rights was not something that went down very well with the different nations. In fact, it was very new and it was not widely appreciated. Um, but Uh, the idea, of course, everyone understood that it was a politically correct thing to do. There has to be an acceptance of this, and it was no longer possible to just wish it away because these were the demands of the time. So I'd just like to quote from Rene Mahieu, the Director General of UNESCO, and this is what he said in 1970. If everyone, as an essential part of his dignity as a man, has the right to share in the cultural heritage and the cultural activities of the community, or rather of the different communities to which man belongs, and that of course includes the ultimate community of mankind, it follows that the authorities responsible for these communities have a duty so far as their resources permit, to provide them with the means for such participation. I repeat this line because this is very important and because it highlights the role of the government. The government has to play a proactive role in matters of cultural policy. If everyone, as an essential part of his dignity, if an individual is to think of the right to culture as an essential part of his dignity as a man, and the government has to play a role there. Similarly, if the individual has to share, has to have the right to share in the cultural heritage and the cultural activities of the community, then also the government must play a role. The authorities have a role because they are the people who are responsible for this community. So you can see a hint of, of patronizing attitude. Nevertheless, it was a very noble effort as it was laid down by Rene Mahieu, the first Director General of the UNESCO. So I repeat, he highlighted the importance of the role of the government in promoting culture and in promoting the cultural life of the people because it was after the right to culture resolution was adopted by the United Nations. Right to culture came to be considered as an integral part of man's dignity. So everyone, I go on quoting him, everyone accordingly has the right to culture as he has the right to education and the right to work. So you have to think about the right to culture in the same way today that you think about the right to education or the right to work. And this is the basis and this is the first purpose of cultural policy. So remember that cultural policy refers to the broad range of measures that are adopted by a government to develop cultural life or to enrich the cultural life of a people. I mean, broadly speaking, we can put it that way. That cultural policy refers to the measures that are adopted by a government in order to enrich the cultural life of its people. So this is the working definition with which we will start our course. And then of course, maybe subsequently, all of us can think of better ways of defining cultural policy. Now, cultural policy sometimes works explicitly with a clearly stated agenda. Sometimes the government says that this time we have, earmarked this amount of money for ensuring that the cultural life of communities in different ways is encouraged. And that's one way of doing it. Say, again, there could be an organization or an institution which is set up by the government to work with this clearly mandated objective. Uh, However, this might not always be the case. Now, this is where cultural policy becomes really interesting. The way it is reflected not in the directly obviously stated goals of the government, where you can see it quite clearly, and there will obviously be an attempt to be politically correct while doing that. But it's in the other instances when cultural policies of the government gets indirectly reflected, that's when it becomes critical. And you can really understand how sincere is the attempt of the state in trying to implement uh, these this cultural policy. So, say for instance, the cultural policy of a government may be reflected in the kind of housing pattern that it encourages in a particular city. Suppose there's a new city being built up, right? Um, Now, what is the housing pattern of that society? How do the makers or the architects, who of course do it, in the cognizance with the cognizance of the state, how do the architects design the spaces? How much of community space have they earmarked for ensuring that people get enough time, enough space to enrich their cultural life? So, how much space do these neighborhoods have for community gardens or auditoriums where children could meet or people could meet and could have cultural programs, things like that? So that is what would really help to enhance the cultural life of a community, isn't it? So that is one of the ways in which the intent of the government is reflected. Um, However, generally speaking, the cultural policy continues to be seen by governments around the world as a very specialized area of concern that only has to do with dance and music. So you have a certain kind of budget set aside for the dissemination of the popular cultural forms or the elitist cultural forms, and that's it. And very often, these choices of items uh, that are selected, for safeguarding or for protection, they reflect political choices. So, which cultural items, for instance, are to be given special care for protection and preservation? Which items require special highlighting? Or which aspects of a culture are to be promoted and why? Who are the authentic bearers of a culture? Who will take the decisions regarding the? So these are political questions, and this is what we will seek to address in different ways through the entire duration of this course. Now, it is generally accepted today that governments around the world must take special initiatives to enrich the cultural life of a community. This is accepted everywhere. That as we were saying, that the governments around the world have to take a more proactive step in protecting and in enriching the cultural lives of communities. Um, I, One can just you know think of an example here. The you know very peculiar kind of dilemma that the policymakers face. If you read Varier Elwin's philosophy for NEFA, And the foreword to that book was written by the first Prime Minister of the country, Jawaharlal Nehru. Now, if you read that preface really carefully, you'll find that it reflects the whole dilemma of cultural policy. Now, Arunachal Pradesh was a restricted area. It is not openly accessible for people from outside. And it was the British who introduced the idea of the inner line permit. Now, Nehru was really in a fix if the Indian government should continue with their policy of the inner line permit or he should do away with that. The reason for this was he says, uh, you know, just allowing these communities who live here in this state to just continue in the same